Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're all about getting to the good stuff, no time wasted. Today, we're diving into a fascinating but often overlooked chapter of the American Revolution. It's something called the Forage War.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? We always think about those big battles, the famous ones. But this period, kind of tucked in there between January and March of 1777, it's a different kind of story.
It's right after Trenton and Princeton, those huge victories for Washington.
Exactly. Both armies, they're hunkered down for the winter in New Jersey, but the fight is far from over. It becomes a war of resources, a war of attrition.
Okay, so we're in for a deep dive here. Our mission's to understand how these smaller skirmishes, this forage war, really impacted the bigger picture of the revolution. We'll be looking at the historical accounts, the military maneuvers, the whole thing. But first, let's break down the name itself. Forage War. What are we talking about here?
Well, you got to remember the logistics of war in the 18th century. The British Army, they need food, sure, for their soldiers, obviously. But the real kicker is the forage.
Forage, like for the animals?
Exactly. We're talking hay, oats, anything to keep those horses and oxen fed and healthy. Without them, the British Army is stuck. Their supplies can't move. Cannons can't be pulled into position.
So it's not just about feeding the troops. It's about feeding the whole war machine.
Right. And Washington, he totally understood this. He sees this vulnerability, this dependence on local supplies, and he exploits it.
Smart. He's
Yeah.
coming off those big wins at Trenton and Princeton, so he's got momentum.
Yeah, total momentum shift. And he doesn't let up. His strategy is to deny the British access to these vital resources, food and forage, basically starve their ability to wage war effectively.
Very targeted strategy. And it's not just the Continental Army doing this, is it? It sounds like the local militias play a huge role here.
Huge, absolutely crucial. We're talking about the militias from New Jersey and Pennsylvania. They're really the backbone of this campaign. And they're not just a ragtag bunch, taking random pot shots. These guys are organized, they're motivated, and some of these engagements involve over 1,000 men.
Wow, so these aren't just small skirmishes. These are serious operations.
Right. And they're constantly harassing British foraging parties, ambushing supply wagons, making the British occupation as difficult and costly as possible.
It's amazing how quickly the tide turned. Just weeks before, the British had control of a big chunk of New Jersey, which I imagine didn't sit well with the locals.
No, not at all. It fueled a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, and that anger translated directly into manpower for the Patriot militias. You had a lot of guys who were ready to fight back.
So it all goes back to those 10 crucial days. Trenton and Princeton. Those victories reignited the fighting spirit, gave the Americans the confidence to go on the offensive.
Totally. And the British, they find themselves overextended. They'd been spread out across New Jersey, but Washington's winter campaign forces them to consolidate.
To pull back.
They pull back, and their main force of about 10,000 troops is squeezed in between New Brunswick and Amboy, with another sizable group further north. And let's not forget, the situation for the British troops isn't exactly rosy at this point.
Yeah, I can imagine. It must have been pretty miserable.
Oh, absolutely. Many locals had abandoned their homes, so you have a ton of troops crammed into whatever buildings are left. Some are even stuck on ships. Disease runs rampant, morale is low, and the area has already been stripped of supplies. They're relying heavily on those preserved rations, the stuff that was shipped across the Atlantic.
So not exactly fresh and tasty. And those horses, they're desperate for fresh forage.
Right. And that's why those foraging expeditions become so vital for the British and so dangerous.
Because Washington sees that weakness, right? He sees their dependence on local supplies and their vulnerable position, and he exploits it.
Exactly. Early in the winter, he sends out detachments to clear out any remaining livestock or provisions that the British could get their hands on. And this leaves the British with no choice but to send out their own foraging parties. And that's when things really heat up.
That's when the Forage War truly kicks off.
Right. The British, they probably expect to just waltz in and take what they need, but they're met with surprisingly fierce resistance. The Americans, often hundreds strong, are ready and waiting.
The Battle of Millstone is a great example of this. It happens on January 20th.
Yep. Brigadier General Philemon Dickinson, he leads about 450 militia. Now remember, these aren't regular soldiers. These are farmers, shopkeepers, ordinary citizens. And they managed to drive back a British foraging expedition. They even capture wagons, horses, livestock.
Everything the British were looking for.
Exactly. And afterwards, the British are stunned. They reportedly couldn't believe they were fighting just militia. It really speaks to the effectiveness and the underestimated strength of those local fighters.
And this wasn't a one-off. Washington, he makes it clear to his commanders, constantly harass the enemy, be aggressive. And it sounds like they had really good intelligence to support these operations.
Oh yeah, intelligence was key. One British commander even complains that the Americans seem to know about their foraging plans just hours after the orders are given. It suggests a very effective network of local informants and spies feeding information to the Americans.
Wow. So they're hitting British supply convoys, disrupting their movements.
All along the Raritan River, the roads from Perth Amboy, it becomes incredibly risky for the British to move anything.
So how do the British respond?
They try to adapt.
Of course, they try to lure the militia into traps
Yeah.
using larger formations of regular troops. They figure bring in the big guns, that'll scare them off.
Classic military tactic.
But the Americans, they're not fooled. Guys like General William Maxwell, they know the terrain, they know how to use it to their advantage.
They're fighting on their home turf.
Exactly. And the late February encounter with Colonel Charles Mawhood is a perfect example. Mawhood, he thinks he's outsmarted a group of New Jersey militia. But suddenly, he finds himself surrounded. The Americans flank his advance, and he's forced to retreat back to Amboy, losing about 100 men.
Yeah, and the elite grenadiers of the 42nd Foot, those are supposed to be their toughest troops, they take a beating. And just a few weeks later, Maxwell pulls off a similar move, repulsing a much larger British force of 2,000 men.
So they're learning, they're adapting, they're using their local knowledge and turning the tables on the British.
Absolutely. And this constant pressure, it's not just about the physical losses. It starts to wear down the British troops mentally. We have that account from Johann Ewald, the Hessian captain, talking about the constant state of alert. The men have to stay dressed day and night. The horse is constantly saddled. Just imagine that, living with that constant tension, never knowing when the next attack might come.
Yeah, no rest for the wicked, as they say.
And the practical consequence of all this harassment is that the British are forced to rely more and more on supplies shipped all the way from Europe. That's expensive, it's risky, and it puts a huge strain on their resources.
So these seemingly small skirmishes are having a major impact on the British war effort.
A ripple effect. It's not just about stealing a few cows or bags of grain, it's about disrupting the entire system.
Okay, let's get into some of the specific engagements. The action around Elizabethtown in early January sounds particularly intense.
Oh yeah, those were a wild few days.
Mm.
It starts with a British cavalry patrol getting ambushed, a small loss, but it sets the tone. Then, a larger patrol of Waldeck infantry, German mercenaries fighting for the British. They get attacked near Springfield and completely wiped out, captured to a man.
Wow.
And the British garrison in Elizabethtown, they hear the gunfire, they panic, they figure a major attack is coming, so they start evacuating. But as they're retreating, the militia hits their rear guard. They capture a bunch of soldiers, baggage, food supply.
A real blow to the British.
Definitely. And it sets the stage for more of the same. We have Colonel Charles Scott's Virginia Continentals capturing a whole bunch of Highlanders at Chatham. The New Jersey militia, they hit German foragers again at Connecticut farms. More captures. It seems like there's a new engagement every few days.
These smaller actions, they're adding up. They're chipping away at the British strength.
Absolutely. Bonhamtown, Woodbridge, these places become synonymous with these clashes, these lightning raids. The action at Woodbridge is particularly impressive. The Jersey Blues, that was the nickname for the New Jersey militia, they ambush 2 whole British regiments. They inflict casualties, but suffer very few losses themselves.
They knew how to use that terrain to their advantage.
For sure. And then there's the incident at Drake's Farm in February. This one's particularly brutal, even though it started as another attempt to disrupt British foraging.
Brutal how?
Well, the British, they set a trap, but the Virginians, instead of retreating as expected, they launch this ferocious attack. They actually break through a battalion of grenadiers.
Grenadiers, those are the tough guys.
Yep, big, heavily armored infantrymen. But eventually, the Americans are forced to retreat under heavy fire. And tragically, some of the wounded Americans who are left behind are killed by British troops. It led to this angry exchange of letters between Generals Stephen and Erskine. Really shows you the raw emotions involved in this conflict.
It's not a game, that's for sure.
No, it's definitely not. And then there's Quibbletown. Even Cornwallis himself, he leads a substantial force out there, but he can't counter the American tactics.
What happens there?
Well, the Americans, under Colonel Scott and Brigadier General Warner, they avoid a direct confrontation with Cornwallis's larger force. Instead, they harass his flanks, his rear, as he's retreating. Even Captain Ewald, that Hessian officer we talked about, he writes in his diary that because of these constant losses during foraging, they're forced to bring supplies all the way from New York.
They can't even get what they need locally anymore.
They can't. The Americans have effectively cut them off, and the skirmishing in that area continued for quite a while.
It's a persistent campaign of disruption. And then there's Spangtown, another significant American victory. Mahood's brigade walks into an ambush. Those grenadiers of the 42nd Foot, they get hammered again. Maxwell's force surrounds the British, inflicts heavy casualties, forces them to retreat back to Amboy.
Yeah, and it all adds up. Historian David Hackett Fisher, he documented 58 separate actions between January and March of 1777, and he even says his list is probably incomplete. The documented British and German casualties are over 900 men.
That's a huge number.
Huge. And if you add that to the losses they suffered at Trenton and Princeton, the British actually lost more men in New Jersey in those few months than during the entire New York campaign the year before.
Wow. And we don't even have the full picture of American casualties, although it's safe to say they were much lower.
Much lower. So it's not just a quiet winter break. It's a brutal war of attrition that's really taking a toll on the British.
It really reframes how we think about this period. And while the most intense phase of the Forage War ends around April, with the Battle of Bound Brook, where Cornwallis almost captures General Lincoln,
Almost.
the effects of that campaign, they linger.
Yeah.
Northern and coastal New Jersey, those areas remain contested, dangerous for the British for the rest of the war. They can't let their guard down.
It's a constant drain on their resources, a constant source of tension.
So to wrap it all up, this Forage War, it might not be as glamorous as those big battles, but it's a crucial part of the story. It shows the ingenuity and resilience of the American forces, particularly those local militias who disrupted British logistics, weakened their army, and crushed their morale.
It's a testament to their commitment, their willingness to fight, their knowledge of the land.
And it proves that you don't always need massive battles to win a war. Sometimes it's about those smaller actions, the constant pressure, the denial of resources that can ultimately tip the scales.
It's about making the enemy's life as difficult as possible, making the cost of staying in the fight too high.
Makes you think about how often those seemingly insignificant conflicts can have a huge impact on the bigger picture, especially when you factor in things like access to resources and the determination of the local population to resist. It really encourages us to dig deeper, to explore those untold stories, like the experiences of those militiamen, the everyday heroes of the Revolution.
Absolutely. Those stories are out there waiting to be discovered.
And that's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.